So it's 2015. I am Katowice just ended this past weekend, and we had the biggest upset in League of Legends history, where the 12th place Chinese LPL team went ahead and eliminated the first place Korean LCK team, the GE Tigers, from the I am Katowice in the semifinals. And this was really surprising, shocked a lot of people. People thought that maybe WE looks really great right now, surprisingly good. So if that's the case, and we're all insisting, like the people who watch LPL and are very vocal about it, are insisting that they're the 12th place LPL team and maybe something more like the 15th place Chinese team or something, because of the fact that there might be a couple LSPL teams a little bit better than them. So how good is the top of the standing? So I wanted to make a set of videos and a series of videos that look at the top four teams, the LGD, Snake, OMG, Edward Gaming, and I wanted to restrict myself to the top four because I feel like if I'm going to go in depth and in detail and talking about the style and the way they play and how they approach the game, then I want to focus on teams that have an identity. And when I'm talking about an identity, we can also use the term that Clement Chu on Summoning Inside like to use. He uses system. I've used identity in the past. It just by that I mean each player kind of has an idea of where he fits into this team, what his job is, in addition to the role he plays on his team. So if he's a jungler, that's like a role, but his job is going to be something like helping maintain vision, or his job might be the carry or something like that. So uh, those teams, I feel like each player kind of has an idea of what exactly he's supposed to do, how the game's going to go, and you have a very distinct feel for when you tune into an LGD or a Snake or an OMG or an EDG game, how that team might play, some of the things they might be good at, what kind of compositions work for that team. Whereas if you start going down the line and you look at Invictus Gaming and Vici Gaming, and they're still trying to figure out what works for them. So that's why I wanted to restrict myself to the top four. So of course I'm going to start with LGD Gaming. They're right now in 4th place. They have 24 points, and the way the LPL system works with the 1-1s, very similar if you followed Champions before, where they play 2 games every time they encounter each other, and teams that 2-0 get 3 points, teams that 1-1 get 1 point, and of course if you don't win the games, you don't get any points. So LGD, the reason why they're fourth, they're 24 points. They're actually only 3 points above IG or VG Gaming. So if LGD loses a series completely and then IG and VG get a 2-0 somewhere, they could actually tie with LGD. So LGD's always kind of been on that cusp of 4th and 5th in the past. So if you're a Curse fan, maybe you're already kind of feeling the pull. You're gravitating towards this LGD team. You want to know more. Forever 4th. Like, what is this mantra? But since they've been in LPL, they've always kind of been the 4th, 5th place team. And a little bit more about LGD, the reason why they have so many 2-0-2s as opposed to the other top 4 teams, they have 4 0-2s, whereas EDG and Snake have 1 and OMG has 0. The reason why they have so many 0-2s is because I feel like there was this period where there was a lot of friction between maybe the jungler and the mid laner, and how the mid laner has historically liked to play the game. And during this period where they started dropping a bunch of games, they dropped games to IG, they dropped games to King, all in the same period of time, was when there was some of that friction, and so they were figuring out a system that worked between them, and they've got that going, and they'll still drop a couple games just because the system is a bit imperfect, and there's obvious flaws in the lineup, and I'll go into that more detail as I go along. So I still consider LGD closer to the OMG and Snake side than I do the Invictus Gaming and Vici Gaming side, who I consider to be like a tier below. And then below that I have the rest of the teams all in a pile, like the bottom 6 is very close, I think. But LGD, let's start a little bit with their history, kind of giving people an idea of where this team came from, how they developed. First of all, LGD is a Dota organization. So if you're a Dota fan, you know LGD. Obviously, they've done very well from themselves in the past, and their League of Legends team is almost kind of an afterthought in that respect, which makes them very unique among the top 4 of LPL, because EDG doesn't really have a Dota team. OMG is primarily a LoL organization. I'm not quite sure about Snake. Snake is a very new organization, but they don't have, if they do have a Dota team, it's not anywhere near the dominance of or the success, I guess. LGD isn't really dominant in Dota, but they've had a lot of success. So LGD, primarily a Dota organization, their League of Legends team was founded in 2012. They didn't really have any of the players that we associate with LGD on it at the time, but you may have heard of No Name was on that roster. If you're a LGD Gaming fan, you know that in LSPL, LGD Gaming's mid laner was Zune. This past LSPL split, and he was on the original LGD team at that time. They were okay during this period. 2012 wasn't really competitive, but they played in the regional qualifier that sent IG to the Season 2 World Championship because WE had auto-qualified by doing sort of the best that year and a bunch of the Chinese events. So they were okay. They were like the 4th, 5th place team again. And then things started to change for them a little bit. After that qualifier in September, PYL joined the team. PYL came from an organization called Noah's Ark. And Noah's Ark actually is famous for having had a lot of really talented players. Whites played for that team at some time. BSYY, who is currently the coach of LGD, played for them at some time. Tabe played for them. Cool played for them. And then, of course, we have PYL. So, all at very different times. Like, none of those players were... It wasn't like all of those players were on the roster at the same time. But PYL ends up joining LGD Gaming. And this is when I think LGD sort of starts to pick up the steam. This is, I think, the big move. Because right now, when I think of LGD, I think of LGD as PYL's team. And PYL is kind of isn't really a big personality, but his personality is very kind of distinct. Very easy. People actually gravitate towards him as he's kind of like a mediator of League of Legends. He has the control over the game, and he's known for being like a very good captain of his team. If you think about some of the moves and some of the smart things that LGD sort of starts to do later, he's the shot caller, the voice behind that. So LGD, PYL's team. They start to get more players, and it's actually for a while they have a lot of Hong Kong players on. So if you follow the Hong Kong Taiwanese scene, you had Stony Lol on that team for a while. Magic Wisdom, really. They don't do very well at Tencent Games Arena, and Tencent Games Arena, for those who don't know, was originally like the big event that everyone wanted to do well in. And then they made LPL in 2013, and LPL was the league like the LCS. So they were made at the same time. And Tencent Games Arena became the event that qualified people for the promotion to get into LPL. And and then 2014 came around and they introduced LSPL, and Tencent Games Arena became the event that qualified people for LSPL, and then LSPL qualified people for... So you kind of get the idea, but at the time, Tencent Games Arena was a big deal. They started to place like 5th, 8th in that range, which obviously you needed to get top 2 to get into the LPL promotion, I believe, at this time. And so they started making more and more changes. They picked up this guy named Rena, the mid laner, for LPL for a while. They picked up a guy named Star, who is a really strong Riven player, and then towards the end of 2013, right, Riven was huge. Remember, at 2013 World Championship, Faker came out with that Riven. They picked up Twen in October, I think, of 2013. So already you have two players who are still on the team. You have Twen or TBQ, and then you have PYL. They end up qualifying, and STYZ was on their roster at this time, so they end up taking first in TGA 2013 winter, which qualifies them for the LPL promotion, and they end up getting into the LPL for that spring 2014. So they're a bit newer to LPL than OMG, for example. But their first split in LPL was also EDG's first split in LPL. But once they get into LPL, they actually surprise a lot of people. Their first best of 2 was against Energy Pacemaker, another team that came from the promotion and actually almost got relegated the previous split, so they've been in LPL before, but They go 0-2 to Energy Pacemaker, and of course, everyone familiar with Energy Pacemaker is like, oh, this is not good. But after that, they do really well against almost everyone else. They take a game from LGD Gaming, which very few people managed to do that split. they start picking up more and more games, and they're looking at like a solid third place team actually behind. Like no one could really knock OMG. OMG, this was their most dominant split. They only dropped 3 games the entire time out of 28. And then Edward Gaming was really high up after that. I think they were only like a few losses behind them. So those were the teams that you couldn't really touch really well, but LGD was really close after that. And then WE and Invictus Gaming start ramping up as soon as they return from their disastrous showing at IEM last year. And LGD starts to get exposed for being a bunch of one-trick ponies. You have your top laner who can only play Riven, and Riven gets nerfed, so suddenly he's no longer a must ban, and so teams start to fixate on other champion picks that LGD is reliant on. STYZ at the time was really much better at his Caitlyn than anyone else, and then in LPL, STYZ and PYL, like, they were getting a lot of attention as a really strong bottom lane, like, really strong contenders, even with the likes of Name of CZF, Wei Xiao was still there. We had UZI, he was mid laner, but then he went back to bottom lane halfway through the season. They were getting a lot of attention. So, but again, starting to get to the point where you could maybe ban some Caitlyn's because you don't have to ban Riven anymore. TBQ, PYL was really reliant on that Lee Sin pick at the time. He could have like God Lee Sin games, like really good Lee Sin games, but then when it was banned, he didn't really seem to know what he was doing. Like his jungle pathing even got worse when he didn't have Lee Sin. So the only player on that squad and then PYL's Thresh was really well known. You had to ban it. Like, you could play other champions, but you almost had to ban his Thresh. So you get to this point where LGD is a team that's really easily banned out, and they start losing games. And their low point ends up being when they drop a game to Positive Energy, who I think only won 6 games that entire split. The last place team at the very end when they played Twitch Jungle. So it's funny, like Twitch Jungle got Invictus Gaming into the playoffs. So LGD on that cusp of 4-5, they dropped to 5th place. They aren't able to be in the playoffs of 2014 spring after being in 3rd place for a very long time. So that's the point where LGD is kind of thinking, okay, we still need more roster changes. Back to the drawing board. Like, who else are we going to get? And STYZ, also another big problem was STYZ at the time it came out after the fact, was trying to get himself kicked from the team, like actively, because this other organization was trying to bribe him to join their team. So you have this situation where champions are being banned out, STYZ is actively trying to get himself banned from the team, and they're still almost 4th place, right? So that's not bad. Of course, I don't think 2014 spring was probably the worst competition-wise split of LPL so far. But they do end up making some roster changes. Obviously, STYZ gets banned from competitive for half a year, so they get a new AD carry who's just a solo Q AD carry named XQ. They get a new mid laner, and this is like their big power pickup of the split. Wayless, who is on the team now. The thing about Wayless, talking about Wayless, is he had a lot of attention in LSPL. And LSPL at the time, there were 3 mid laners that everyone was talking about. Jiangun had made a transition from the top laner of Young Glory, who he played top for Young Glory in 2013 summer. And he transitioned into mid lane, and he was starting to make like these crazy plays. You had Shia, who people now are familiar with Shia internationally. I am Katowice, when he played a bunch of crazy stuff like the TF, the Annie mid, during the LSPL at this time, and he was really strong laner, like a really strong laner. And then you had Wayless, who 3rd place LSPL team, so Vici Gaming didn't get auto promoted to LPL at the time. They just barely missed that cutoff. But Wayless was offered a spot on LGD, who's also offered a spot on WE. And he comes out and he says, and this is the first time we really get something like this, where he says, I was offered a spot on WE, but I didn't want it because I want to work with PYL. So you're turning down at the time an opportunity to play for like the TSM of China, like the most prominent, the most famous, well-known, and well-loved team in your region, and you turn it down because you want to play with this captain of this like fourth, fifth place LPL team. So he chose to do that, and he also had, there were a lot of murmurings about he would always make the hero play. He would always like try to dive past the tower. He'd always try to go for the outplay, and he had to be the center of the attention. And he had a little bit of a tilt factor, and so LGD Gaming kind of said, you know what, if you want our star player, you can have him. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that if you watch his progression from when LGD picked him up to now, his playstyle has changed very drastically. It's gone much more selfless, and he's much more about vision control and like trying to set up the vision control in his own jungle, conducting some of those roams, supporting Chwen in his jungle, and some high mobility picks like the Ari. He's even played the Nidalee mid, which only Pon has played also in the league, so he still does a lot of kind of the selfish picks like the Diana, which hasn't really been successful for them at all. But he's grown and developed a whole lot as a player, and I really enjoy watching Wayless's play because I think his style is really unique. He still obviously has like a few issues with like tilt, some of the more selfish picks, but overall I think he's a really solid player, and LGD ended up like in the long, it ended up being a really strong investment, and I think it will continue to pay off and as he develops more and more. They keep Star for a while, but they end up having to replace him just because they need someone who can play something other than Riven. 17 is who they pick up. He's actually a solo queue mid lane player. He's not that great or well-rounded, and his champion pool was still, had a lot of Yasuo, other things like that. And I think there was a bit of a friction where he wanted to make some hero plays too, but he wasn't as good as Wayless, so the team would end up being split on who to follow, whatever, and the Wayless really had to step it up and say, you know, I'm carrying this team, I'm getting the farm in the jungle. But at the time, LG was trying to work on these problems, and you start to see this identity forming. PYL and XQ become this really strong bottom lane again. I mean, PYL, his bottom lanes always look really strong, and then STYZ goes and plays for WE and does less damage than the enemy top laner, so just think about it. And they start to look like a really strong bottom lane, so because at the time you have your like UZI and Zero, and you have your Name and your FCCF, and they looked like this time they were like the third strongest bottom lane. Because Wei Xiao and Conan wasn't really a bottom lane so much as Wei Xiao, unrelated. What ends up happening with that is they have this really strong bot lane, they have this really strong mid laner, but they have these two weak pain points still, where they have this top laner who isn't really performing on top lane champions, you have this jungler who still has a champion pool issue, who ends up having these other issues that are showing up more as the jungle talent pool increases. You have Loveling going back to the jungle, because he played support in 2013 Spring. You have Insect coming to the scene, Soest getting promoted up. A couple other junglers start to stand out a little bit, and Chwen, just a lot of his weaknesses become exposed. Like, he is too overzealous in his engages. Some of his dives are really sloppy and uncoordinated. So LGD has to work around these flaws in some way, and this is when LGD develops like their control over sidewave minion pushing, which they still have. It's very, when I think about LGD and something that's integral to their identity, it's the way they control the sidewaves and the way that the minions will always be pushing in their favor when you watch these LGD games. And this made it so that they could make more mistakes than other teams in LPL. They could pick more disadvantageous fights, they could make maybe more mechanical misplays on their jungle and their top laner, because even if they lost those fights, like, the enemy team couldn't take objectives against them because the minions would be pushing on them. So LGD ended up having a lot more deaths than the other top half teams in the tournament. They had like almost twice the deaths of like the second place team. it was significantly increased, but they got the wins. Like they took wins off Edward Gaming, they took wins off, and they always split 1-1 with Starhorn Royal Club. It's really great to watch those sets because Starhorn Royal Club would have these mechanically advanced players, right? And LGD would just, okay, we're gonna out rotate you a little bit here. We're gonna take this tower while you try to chase 17 down here. We're gonna take this tower. The first time they beat them, they had this really smart composition. Star was still on the team, and they had this heavy dive, like shield type composition where they had Diana, Star, Twen, and you think about like how much those teams can just like individually tank and dive. So that they beat them with that, and then the second time they beat Starhorn Royal Club, they had this Jinx composition based around taking towers and having the minion speed of like the movement speed of the Jinx Lulu, and then just moving right away to the next objective and out-rotating Starhorn Royal Club in that way. So LGD sort of became China's smart team. They couldn't necessarily compete with the talent level on teams like OMG, on teams like Edward Gaming, on teams like Starhorn Royal Club, but they could outmaneuver them in these ways. Now, they end up barely making playoffs this time. So last time, down to the wire, they get knocked out of playoffs for IG. This time, down to the wire, they end up knocking WE out of playoffs because Edward Gaming 2-0s WE, but they managed to get like this one game off of Edward Gaming. And they end up in the playoffs. If I recall correctly, they don't win a single game in the playoffs. Regionals, though. So the way that the regional selection worked is if you placed top 4 in playoffs in summer, you could go to regionals. If you placed top 2 in spring, you could go to regionals. It was slightly more complicated, but I'm not going to get too deep into it. They go to regionals, and they almost actually end up being the 3rd seed for regionals, for Worlds, for China, because they eliminate IG. Well, I mean, everyone eliminated IG. It was a double elimination. Starhorn Royal Club knocks out both of them, and then both them and OMG, and then they face OMG in the finals, and they win the first game. Second game, San actually has this crazy Kog'Maw performance where he just carries. Third game, it gets down to the wire. LGD's winning, and then Cool just is like, hold my beer, and solo carries that team to Worlds. But LGD almost made it to Worlds. So now LGD is in this place where they're trying to smart team. So they might need a little bit more talent to just push them over the edge to get them out of that 4th, 5th place rut. So you immediately begin to think Twen, 17. These are obvious problems that might need replacing. But the first move that they actually make at this point is to sign Imp. And I was a little bit surprised here. I do think it's impossible to argue. Imp is obviously an upgrade over XQ, but XQ is making gains. Again, they were already probably like the 3rd best bottom lane in LPL at the time. So I didn't really think that was a point you necessarily had to visit as long as you have Twen, because if you want to replace Twen or XQ, my mind immediately went to Twen. Obviously, there were reasons to get Imp. Imp, again, like Wayless, came out and said that he wanted to play with PYL as a captain, that he had other offers, and he took LGD. So that's the first part about the Imp acquisition, is that Imp actually really wanted to work with this team in particular. And then you have, after the Imp acquisition, they do end up looking at 17, the top laner, which would be the next move you would go. And they picked up 2 top laners. One was Acorn, one was Flame. Acorn's reputation, he's much more utility based. He fits in with this team that already you are thinking Imp, Wayless, 2 playmakers. You don't really want another playmaker necessarily. It's nice to have a reliable top laner who can teleport, who can back you up, who can play some of this really strong rumble that we've seen come out. And I'm not discounting Flame. I think Flame has actually surprised me a lot, and may surprise people who expect him to just play that carry split push style. He's been playing a lot more of a utility role. I think that maybe the team was trying to force Acorn into these carry roles on like the Aurelias and the Cannons, and force Flame into the Rumbles, the Nars, things like that, to see which ones had more dimensions, and I actually think Flame did end up showing quite a bit of versatility in that regard. And so I don't think that the decision is immediately clear which one to go with. I think that from what the LG organization has said, the team has just practiced more with Acorn. They're more comfortable with Acorn just because Acorn arrived earlier, maybe, and just maybe the communication's easier or something like that. So I think that's probably the biggest factor, not so much the champion pools and the playstyles. But they do end up with, so going into the 2015 season, they end up with the Acorn Flame, Twen, Midlane Wayless, Imp, and PYL. So it's already a pretty talented roster going in. And so at this point, I want to define what does their identity look like now. When you turn on an LGD game, what should you expect from that set? If you've been with me so far in recounting the history, you already have an idea of how I think of LGD Gaming as a team. As a smart team, I said the fundamental to them is pushing out the side waves, but the real core issue is, and I think that I tend to define teams by their weakest aspect, and this could be a rude thing to say, just say this is where they have their limitation, but I think many strong teams end up taking where they're weak and making it into a strength in some way. For example, I think that because Twen has a weaker jungle performance, it's sad to say, I think he's one of the weakest junglers, if not the weakest jungler in the league. And you think, top 4 team, how do they have one of the weakest junglers in the league? The way that they make up for this is actually quite ingenious. They have much more roam pressure coming out of their mid lane and their support player than any other team in LPL probably. And the way this sort of came out, and we talked about the weekend where they went 0-2 to IG and 0-2 to King, and they have more 0-2s because of that than any other team in LPL, and it was just one weekend. It's when this conflict between Wayless's previous playstyle and the way Chen, the new jungle, came to a head. Because Wayless used to find these advantages by out-farming, and he would do this in some cases in the Spectral Wraith. He'd play these heavy wave clear champions, he'd go roam, he'd pick up more minions, and eventually he would get this lead and he could just kill you. He could just kill anyone on the map. Because he was very good at finding ways to get to eke out this little bit of a minion advantage and snowball it from there. So obviously, in the new patch, jungle can't spawn much less frequently, and if you have a weaker jungler already, putting him behind is really rough. So you don't necessarily want to do that. So instead, his playstyle has started to change, and he's much more about roaming and finding advantages in the roam, and if he gets a minion advantage in lane or some kind of gold advantage in lane, he'll actually spend it on wards. He'll go travel with either PYL or he'll travel with Twen and ward out the jungle, because if you get Twen is an easy target, I think, for enemy teams to you want to invade him, but if you know that Wayless is going to be there, you don't want to mess with that, right? If you don't want to mess with PYL and Wayless and Twen. So, also because of this, because PYL roams so much, I think that Imp and PYL is probably the best 2v2 in the league. Maybe UZI and Cloud, now that they're playing together, could give them a run for their money, but for a while there's just no 2v2 that was that good. I mean, Deft and Mako is actually pretty good, but I think Mako is much more of a roaming support too by nature. So you're sacrificing this place where you could get a really obvious advantage, again, to help your jungler and to help the team overall. And this is a playstyle. So you can already think that maybe LGD are intentionally setting themselves behind in lane so they can have a stronger team overall in the late game. And they rely on the minion waves to help them pull back. But they also try a bunch of other crazy, like, if you're already grouped, kind of dives that actually, coordination-wise, tend to go a little wrong, and I'll show you a clip and try to point out a little bit of what I mean by that. The first thing you want to notice, and this is smart and very typical of LGD, is that they know that Baka is going to get his blue buff in his own jungle, and his team is gathering to prepare for him there. They had the vision enough to know that, especially with that blue ward that you can kind of see. This is very typical. Wayless will go in and use those kinds of opportunities to help PYL or TBQ lay down vision. And he's especially doing well for himself in lane, so you can use that advantage in that way. Now this is the part where I believe they overplayed their hand a little bit. PYL and Acorn and TBQ go to dive this tower, but there's a little bit of a lack of coordination. I think this is actually very common in some of their dives, where they might have the communication off, or I'm not sure entirely what it is, but PYL should not have ended up tanking that turret there, and it cost them a kill that they didn't need. And meanwhile, on the bottom lane, Snake is able to get quite a bit of pressure off of that. Now, obviously, that was just one example that I looked at with the failed dive in the early game, but you constantly see some of these engaged miscommunications in more risky situations with LGD that are centered around TBQ. And I'm not sure if it is TBQ or if it's just an issue of this is when we go in, this is when we don't go in. You see in the first EDG LGD series, almost continuously he would engage in these really awkward moments, just go in for reasons unknown. When we talk about players who have an issue with, I'm Jarvan, I'm helping, the trapping them into ultimates, is just, his engagement sense is really off. And I don't know if it's a team communication issue, if it's rushed in the middle, he doesn't know when to go in and when to not go in. PYL got caught out there, maybe that was less of a miscommunication, but you see these rushed dives kind of go wrong continuously for LGD. So first of all, we've established that LGD continuously doesn't use their laning resources in order to help out Tren with some of his jungling mishaps, some of his weaker aspects where he can't necessarily defend his jungle by himself. So you have Wayless and PYL making those moves in that sense. Then you have, in order for them to kind of try to make up for that, they try to orchestrate these dives, because if you're going to have a bunch of people roaming anyway, then why not just all amass yourselves in one lane and try to kill the top laner and get a turret. But that ends up going wrong. So you see how very easily LGD is going to end up behind coming out of laning phase. It's very typical for them, so they get to this point where they have to shove out the minion waves and make sure that they're constantly keeping that going so that they can try to pick these really intelligent fights and get gold back that way. And this is where I think that they have more of their strength there. In this way, you think of the Koreans as like sideway, minion management, pushing, out maneuvering with these split pushes, things like that, out rotating, like picking these objectives. LGD does that so they can fight more often. And again, I talked about they died a lot because they could constantly fight more because the minions were pushing it, and they still do that kind of thing. Only now, because they have some more talented players, you have Acorn, who's a really good Rumble player, and even with Flame playing Rumble, they have an 8-4 win-loss record with Rumble. Rumble's really strong pick for them. They had 3.62 KDA. And they like to set up fights off of that kind of AoE situation where you pick down, and one of their better compositions, like the compositions that they kind of just pull out very frequently, is a composition with like a Kennen, some form of lockdown and knockup. And in the clip that we saw last, we had the Rek'Sai and the Cho'Gath to kind of chain CC and lock someone down, so that when Acorn can use his Slicing Maelstrom, he will be able to get enough people in the stun to get it off. Like, they'll be locked down so that the chain CC can go off, because if you just go in with the Kennen, everyone's just going to scatter and no one's going to really get locked up. So you want that additional lockdown, and LGD is very good at doing that. Their power pick, their biggest power pick, I think, because of that, is going to be the Janna. And this might sound strange, because if you're running hard engage, why do you necessarily... You want Janna so the enemy team can't have it, right? Janna, in that sense, is actually really huge for LGD. PYL has really, really clutch monsoons, and a little bit of the movement speed, and of course she got some of this nerfed, is useful so that he can make more roams, he can do more with vision and stay safer by himself as an independent force. So PYL is Janna, I think, is their strongest power pick of all, in this sense. They have a 6-4 win rate on it. 7.35 KDA on that Janna. In this really competitive league where LGD frankly dies quite a bit, is pretty impressive. Now, that's a little bit of an idea of what they like to do. So let's look at one of their team fights, in particular from this game, since we're already watching it, this LGD Snake game, and we'll go from there. So again, the first thing you'll see here is that there is an issue with the minion waves being pushed in LGD's favor. Beast actually goes down to try to deal with that before the fight starts, and then he has to regroup. They're very good at using their front line in these sorts of narrow situations. They love to use these AoE comps, and here we have the engagement where we see two enemies at the front line just kind of going at Wayless, and Wayless is using this pick very well, where he immediately blows up Beast, and they end up being able to use Acorn's engage very well off of that. So just their ability to group and to pick these fights based on vision, based on the minion waves going, so that the enemy team is kind of more scattered beforehand, and they can identify who the major threat is, and for Snake it's usually going to be Crystal, and they take it out and they manage to win this fight very cleanly. So I think I've highlighted sort of the way LGD falls behind in laning phase and the way they come back. I think their team fighting is some of the best team fighting in the league. I think you get into the situation where obviously LPL is known for team fighting, so the best team fighting teams are going to be at the top. And in particular, I don't even think that they're necessarily super mechanically good or in terms of getting their communication so it's perfect and they stack these. It's just that they're very good at taking advantages of these perfect setups with vision, with the minion waves, and when it all comes together with controlling the map as a team instead of just putting it all on your jungler and necessarily your support. Having these picks like the Graves, like the Sivir, and shoving out the minion waves so that the rest of your team can do whatever they want. Now, that's when you realize that the key to LGD is, first of all, you can't, they're going to go for the early towers. They're going to try to compensate for the fact that their laners fall behind a little bit for not having the 2v2, for not having Wayless in lane all the time. In farm, so they want to compensate by getting these towers right away. So they're going to try to do the dives, they're going to try to do those things. So the first thing that you need to do to sort of defeat LGD is pick lanes that can hold against dives and have really good wave clear. And there's actually recently Master 3 played a very, very smart composition into them, and you look at the Master 3 lineup and you kind of, Master 3 is so far down, how did they split 1-1 with LGD? And they did exactly the blueprint for defeating LGD. They had, they picked the Lissandra away from them first of all, which Lissandra is something that LGD likes to use a lot. They love the Kennen via Lissandra compositions. So they got rid of that pick for them. They ended up picking, and Lissandra also has, on patch 5.4, she still has really good wave clear. They picked the Victor, which has very good wave clear, and I think they picked the Sivir, also. All three lanes, very good wave clear, can hold the towers very well. So you're essentially picking an LGD comp against LGD, so you can keep the minion waves pushed out, you can hold the towers, and you can keep them from making up some of these disadvantages they get in the early game by constantly pushing the minions back. And so if you kind of out LGD, you can't they don't get these perfect setups. And then Twen starts making these desperate engages that we see more when LGD falls behind against teams like EDG, if you watch the EDG series. So these are how to kind of step-by-step dismantle LGD, and I think that that's a really good game to watch if you haven't watched the second M3 versus LGD game. A very, very interesting game overall. I would recommend it a lot for those interested in seeing some of LGD's weaknesses on display. Another weakness that they have is sometimes, again, it's Wayless. If he tilts, or if he just wants to pick a certain champion, I don't know what the deal is exactly. Like Diana, what's the Diana thing? Wayless almost always, I think, I asked in the AMA, how does Wayless come up with these ideas? He did the Ezreal really early on this year. He did the AP Kog'Maw before we saw CJ and SKT do it in Korea. he did some other picks, like really, the Lysandra really early. He did some of these picks like almost right before they were good. Now he's one of the front runners with the Cho'Gath pick. He picked up a lot of the early Diana that's taking off. I have no idea why it's taking off because I think the Diana is not good. It gives up way too much early pressure when LGD is already giving up a lot of pressure. And he can end up being very good with it, but the games don't last long enough kind of for him to get off the ground. So he'll get these quadra kills at the very end, but his base is already broken by that point. One of the really funny things that we saw, the funny LGD moments, is Edward Gaming set the first game. LGD actually ended up almost winning this. PYL wanted to pick Ahri for Wayless. I think of all of the champions right now, Ahri is kind of the champion that Wayless should be playing. It does what he wants to do. I actually also really like him on the underlead. The move gives him the mobility, gives him the assassination power for finding picks, allows him to have this vision control. If he gets this early snowball, he just has to go into the enemy jungle and then no one will mess with him and he can do whatever he wants with the wards. He can bully the enemy jungler, he can do whatever he wants. So that's a pick that I really like on him, and PYL meant to pick Ahri in the first game against Edward Gaming. Ends up locking in Syndra because he can't find the Ahri pick and it's counting down and he kind of panics and he just grabs the Syndra. I don't think Wayless was playing it at all. It was pretty obvious that he hadn't been practicing it, but he could get the ults onto Deft, and so that they could win the fights in this regard. I think they maybe would have taken that game if he'd had the Ahri. But it was probably one of the better LGD moments so far. Just some of these things, you wonder, are they 100% serious? Maybe they want to work with PYL because the environment's a little bit more relaxed. Whenever you see them on the stage, they're like always happy and smiling. You see all these videos and these pictures of them online when they're streaming, and Acorn and even Flame really seems happy in the house. So I mean, you have a lot of that's probably PR related, but whereas you have players like Spirit coming out and saying, you know, I just want to win a game. You have UZI crying on stage. You have a bunch of the very serious stoic Crystal face, and the identity of LGD is very fun. So that if you want to be a fan of that kind of team, LGD is the team that you follow, and follow them on Twitter at LGD Gaming. They like to post a lot of like karaoke type videos, images on their pages, things like that of their players. So they're a really nice team to sort of get invested in. So thank you for watching. If you liked this, I'll be coming out with more videos about Snake, about OMG, Edward Gaming, in very similar veins. And I think Frostgren wanted to do some narrative related stuff too. So just if you want to get invested in these teams, if you like these teams, we'll probably also cover some of the lower level teams later on. That's great. Follow us on Twitter at CL Chinese LOL BC. Subscribe to the channel, everything else. Thank you very much, and have a great day.